Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you for returning to the second phase of the SURE Summer RDM program. Today is really going to be focused on more of a workshop style of session, so you're going to have plenty of time to work today. We're also going to be addressing some of the questions that those of you who had them posed in the survey that we sent out last week. So just to give a little bit of an overview, again, as a reminder, my name is Kevin Reed, and I'm a health sciences librarian here, and I've been supporting data management at the institution since I got here about 3 years ago, and over my career for 10 years. We have Sarah Rutley here as well, who is going to be keeping track of any questions that you have in the chat. So please feel free to do that as you work through the different sections of the data management plan today. We, of course, have Merle, the lead of the SURE program for this summer, and who's here to help support us as well. And we have Sheila, if you want to wave, Sheila, who's helping with any technical issues. So if you can't hear me or you're running into any Zoom issues, please let me know. So the plan for today is really to do a really quick introduction and recap to what we learned before. And then the bulk of this session is going to be on giving you an overview of the different elements of a data management plan, and mostly spent on work time. So we're going to go through the data management plan section by section and giving you a substantial amount of time to be able to work on it with us present. So if you have questions or we want to start a discussion as you're working through it, we can do that. Most people said online, so it's going to be a little bit logistically challenging here, I think, because some of you are working in groups, you might be in the same room, but a lot of us are working independently, but that doesn't mean that the issues that you might be facing in your data management plan might differ from someone else's. So please, any questions that come up, let us know. And then we'll conclude by just going over some final logistics and next steps as to the last two components of the program. One of the questions that someone had before we started was, when you're building your data management plan, are you doing it for yourself as a student or for your faculty supervisor's lab? And really the intent of this project was for you as a student to build a data management plan for your summer project. But if you're working with your supervisor or your professor, and you've come to an agreement where you want to work on it a little bit more broadly in the scope of the bigger project that they're working on, that's fine too. But just know that the original intent was for you to work on a plan for the work that you would be doing over the summer. So I just wanted to clear that up right away. Any questions or comments about that before we begin? Okay, great. So yeah, in terms of questions as we go through, please feel free to either raise your hand and speak, or you can post it in the chat, and I will pause quite frequently to make sure that we answer anything that you have. Okay, so quick recap. What is a data management plan? What are we talking about here? So for those of you who hopefully remember, the data management plan is a strategy for how you're going to produce data and documentation during each stage of your research project, from the study design phase all the way down to the end of the project where you're ready to disseminate and share it. And the goal of the data management plan is to make sure that your data is understandable to others so it can be reused, reproduced, and/or shared. I wanted to share this slide with you because I think this article from Nature in 2018 is a really great depiction of why a data management plan is important. It says everyone needs a data management plan, and it's an essential part of research. And I love the subline here because it says, even though they sound dull, they're essential. And so all of the work that you're going to be doing today, and that you've hopefully been doing a little bit before we got started here, is really essential to making sure that your research is transparent and understandable to you and to others who might come after you in the lab, or who you might be working with as collaborators later on. And so again, one of the main reasons we're doing this program and why we're working with you on a data management plan is because of these new guidelines from the tri-agency. So again, if you were to ever apply for funding from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research or NSERC or SSHRC, you would have to submit a data management plan and indicate where you would deposit your data. So these are two key elements here that are important for you to think about. And this is really why the impetus for sharing this program, first and foremost. So ultimately, what we're hoping that you'll realize from doing this is that data management plans can really make your life easier. So Once you create one plan, it can create a consistent approach that you use from start to finish for other projects that you do later on. It improves coordination with team members because all of the people who are responsible for certain tasks are outlined. It will keep you more organized and it reduces redundancy. So again, if you can follow a certain framework with this plan, you can do that framework over and over again. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel over and over again. And so these are the key 7 elements of a data management plan and what's included. So data collection, documentation and metadata, storage and backup, preservation, sharing and reuse, responsibilities and resources, and finally, ethics and legal compliance. And so what we're hoping to do today, and some of the instructions were sent out ahead of time, and I know that not everyone gets a chance to get to their email before they start. So what we would like everyone to do today is to make sure that they have an open project created on the DMP Assistant. So I'm just going to bring this over. You should have a plan set up and ready to go for this project. Does anyone need time by a show of hands to set up a project quickly before we start? Any hands in the participant list, Sarah?
Not that I'm seeing, but
Okay.
I just want to make sure that yeah, not that I'm seeing.
Okay.
If someone has raised their hand and I'm not seeing it, please say so. Please just throw something in the chat.
Okay.
But it doesn't look like it.
So we had asked before that if you're working on a team, because we couldn't be in person, to either be in the room together, and hopefully those of you who are working in groups have done so. If not, we're going to ask that you work on your data management plan individually and reconvene after the workshop to coordinate the notes so you can create one final plan. Just because logistically, if we have a couple people in breakout rooms and everyone else is in the individual rooms, we wouldn't be able to share questions with everybody. So this is the approach we've taken based on the format that we have available. We ask that you have the slides with you from last session for reference, because we will be touching on a lot of the different questions and elements we talked about in the first session will help you answer the questions in the data management plan. And finally, what we're going to do is really have an open 10 to 15-minute period for each part of the plan for you to work on, so that as you're working through and questions come up, we can discuss them as a group and go forward. So we're here really as a support system for you as you work through your plan, so that it can be as best as possible and that you feel comfortable answering the questions according to your needs. So before we get started, I'll just pause one more time. Are there any questions, or does anyone need clarity on what we're doing? We're essentially going to go into our plan and start writing each part of the plan. Now, some of you may already be fairly far along, whereas others of you may not be, and that's okay. Really, we're just trying to give the flexibility. So if you're done early, out of the 10, 15 minutes, just take a break, and I'll always give a time and when we reconvene before we go forward. Okay, so I'll just pause. Any questions or comments?
No hands in the chat so
Okay.
far, or in the participant list.
Okay. Hopefully that means oh, there we go. Alana has a question. Alana, go ahead.
Hey, Kevin. Just sorry. Prior to starting the data management plan, there's a section for the contributors. When I tried to set an affiliation for contributors outside of the University of Saskatchewan, it wouldn't let me. Can you kind of explain why?
So was it in this section here?
Yes, it was.
So what will happen strangely, so let's say I wanted to add Sarah to this particular example. It's going to give you, if I delete this, right, it's going to give you a name that says, oh, this is wrong. It's you can only enter one list of suggestions. But if I changed it, let's say I made Sarah from the University of Calgary, and I clicked and I said, let's say I chose she's going to be a principal investigator, and I hit save, it would still list Sarah as the University of Calgary. So even though that alert comes up, you should still be able to enter a different institution name. Does that help?
I'm gonna try it and I'll let you know or I guess I'll let you know when we have our 15
Okay.
minutes open. Sorry.
No problem. It's strange that it does that, and we're actually working on fixing that as part of the national group. So it's a great thing to point out because it makes it seem like you can't enter a different affiliation in there. So great question.
Sorry, if I may just add on to it, I just tried to put, so they're not part of a university. We have a contract with them to help with an app development,
Right.
and they're not a university, part of a university. So it's not giving me the option as a name I list as one of the listed suggestions. Does it not allow people outside of like universities?
And so when you click save, it doesn't work?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Excellent point, and I'm going to write that down. And it seems like what's happening is right now it's only letting the illicit affiliations in the particular data bank in the DMP Assistant do that. So that's a problem that needs to be fixed. And so
Okay.
you're right to have run into that issue.
Oh, okay, perfect. Thank you
Okay.
for clarifying.
Thanks for the question. Okay. Any other questions before we get started? Great. So we're going to start with the first element and probably one of the most important components of a data management plan, and that's the data collection phase. This is where in the data management plan, you're going to be asked to respond to 3 key questions. So what types of data are you going to collect? Are you going to create? Are you going to link to or acquire and or record? So in this case, again, you want to be considerate of what we talked about in the last session. The data inventory is key here. Keeping track of what you're going to be collecting is what you want to write down here. Again, if you're expecting to use data that already exists from an existing source, make sure that you're recording where that source comes from. Is it from StatsCan? What year was it created? Is there a specific version associated with it? This is where you're going to document that information. The second falls under the sort of preservation umbrella in terms of what file formats are you collecting your data in. So if you're doing app development or you're working with proprietary software, what are the formats that are being created there? And just so you can keep track of what might I need to change or transform to make sure it's usable to others. And then finally, what conventions and procedures are you going to use to structure, name, and version control your files? So in this case, we're really talking about, with this question, the file organization and file naming. That's really what they're asking for here, is how are you going to make sure that you can find your data and that you're organizing it in a way that's going to be versioned appropriately. And so these are the 3 key questions we want you to work on for the next 10 to 15 minutes. So at this point, we're going to check in at around 1:25 to see how people are doing. And with every section, we're actually going to share the answers that we provided to a data management plan that Sarah and I created for a research project last year. So you'll be able to see how we answered these questions. It might not be exactly as you have, but at the same time, it gives you an example of how we've particularly approached this. So you can either opt to choose this route or go a route that you feel like is more comfortable to how you're doing your research. So with that, we're going to give you about 10 minutes to start, so 10:25 to work on this. And if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand and ask them out loud or pose them in the chat and we'll answer them as they come in. So you have the flexibility in the room to do so now. Please go ahead and get started. And we're here for support if you need us.
Kevin?
Yes.
I think I should best pause the recording then.
Yeah,
Okay,
I
thank
think
you.
that makes sense. Okay. So the next section really comes down to the idea of how you're going to make that data understandable to other people. And so the key questions in this section are, what documentation will be needed for the data to be read and interpreted correctly in the future? So this may look like the data dictionary we talked about last time. It may be that you want to create a user guide for someone so that they would know exactly what to do with the data as it goes through. And so your interpretation of this question is ultimately up to you as to how you're going to ensure that your data is going to be documented and understandable to others. So think about what you could do in order to make that more understandable to other people. The second question is really an accountability question, right? So the question is, how are you going to make sure that documentation is created and captured throughout the project? So you might say, oh, I'll make a data dictionary right now, and that's fine. But as your project evolves, or if your data changes, what are the steps that you're going to take to check in with yourself to look specifically for ways to document that data at different stages of your project? So maybe one of the common ways you can do this is to think about it from the life cycle. So at the data collection phase, you're going to create documentation that describes your data. During the data analysis phase, you're going to create a plan that could be read by somebody else. And then you'll create a user guide that puts it all together. So think about it from that perspective, is what are some touch points over the course of your project where you can check to make sure that the documentation is appropriate. And then the last one is a little bit complicated in the sense that it's really a more of a librarian-y approach to things, but what it's asking is, if you're using a metadata standard, what tools will you be using to describe your data? And so I wanted to just talk really briefly about what we mean by that before we sort of send you forth in this area. And so for any of us who are not familiar, metadata is literally defined as data about data. So it's data that defines and describes the characteristics of other data. And there are many, many standards out there that exist in different disciplines that can be helpful for you to do so. And so I've just provided you with a really simple example of what metadata might look like for a data set. So you have information about the title, who created that particular data set, what is the subject of the data, who contributed to it, when was it created, what is the type. So it's just to give you a sense of, we're literally just documenting individual elements about your data set that could be helpful to somebody else. And so that's the third part of the question. And if you don't have anything, and you don't have a standard that already exists, then you can answer, I will not be using a standard for metadata, and that's okay too. I'm seeing there is a question. Oh, perfect. So Sarah is sharing with you a link that will highlight different metadata standards for different disciplines. So you can get a depiction of what these might look like and the types of information you might document if you intend to use one. Are there any questions about these three particular questions in the DMP before we get started? Okay. So I'm going to share what we have included in our data management plan for documentation and metadata, for how we're going to make sure documentation is captured consistently, and whether or not we're using a metadata standard. So it's currently 1:30. Let's check in at 1:40. And you can work on this section. And this is one I really want you to encourage to think about. Again, how am I going to make sure this is understandable to someone else? So if you leave your project, that your supervisor or your professor could go back to your data 2 years from now, and they'll know exactly what you did. They'll be able to say, oh, I have all the tools I need to understand this data and incorporate it into my research going forward. So keep that in your mind as you fill out these questions. And if you have questions, again, please raise your hand or enter into the chat. So yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
we do have one question that just came into the chat, Kevin.
Okay. So we'll move on to storage and backup. Maybe what I'll start doing is just checking in with people a little bit earlier and seeing if people need more time, just because, again, we don't have to take the whole 2 hours if we don't need them. We just want to give you the time and the opportunity for questions. So moving on to storage and backup, this one should be relatively straightforward in the sense that what it's asking you is, what are the anticipated storage requirements for your project in terms of space? So how many megabytes, gigabytes, or terabytes are you working with? And what's the length of time you're going to be storing it for? And so again, here you might be thinking about, there might be certain university policy that requires that you destroy your data 5 years after creation. That's one particular way to look at it, or you might actually intend to use that data later on. So you want to indicate that here. How long are you going to be saving your data for? The second is the how and where. So where is your data going to be stored and how is it going to be backed up? So in this particular instance, right, if you're using university storage, like OneDrive, for example, or Data Store or RedCap, it's important to put that here. but you may want to include language also that describes why REDCap or why OneDrive is a supported solution at the institution that provides backup for you. So just keep that in mind. And then finally, how will the research team and other collaborators access, modify, and contribute to data throughout the project? So if it's just you and your supervisor, indicate that here. But how are they going to get access to it? Are you just using a shared folder? The answer here does not have to be complicated, but you just want to be specific and detailed about where is the data, how big is it, how are you getting access to it, and how are you going to make sure that it's not going to get lost if something happens. So think about being very explicit as to answering these questions directly, and that will help you get through that process. So these are, I see a question.
Oh, it's actually just me with a
Okay,
hopefully helpful link.
perfect. Thank you, Sarah. So here are some examples of our storage and backup that we included. And that information is available here for you to see. And I'd say for now, let's go ahead and work on this for the next, until maybe 2 minutes to 1:50 and what I'll like 1:48, and I'll touch base then and see if we need more time. But again, here, think about being explicit and deliberate and direct about where your data is going to live. And if different data is going to live in different places. So I know, Asmahan, you had mentioned that you have multiple different kinds of data. If that data lives in other locations, keep that organized based on how you answer the data collection phase. So if you have many different types of data that might live in different places, try to keep it organized by data type. Documentation and metadata. I was curious about anyone on the call who's thought about and answered these questions, what kind of documentation you might be able to use for your summer project. Would anyone be willing to share potentially approaches that they took to documentation that they're going to be using for their summer work? Anyone feeling brave to share that with the group? Because it can also give others ideas of things that they could do as well. You can either share in the chat if you feel less brave, and if you're feeling like comfortable enough to talk, then any ideas that you've created to answer these questions would be much appreciated. It gives us ideas too.
I want to contribute.
Yeah.
The thing is that we created README files for our input files and how to use our software. And we, I think, uploaded one of our README files for how to use the software into the website. So yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, README files, always an excellent way and a simple way to get the message across quickly. So thanks for sharing. Anybody else? Awesome. Thank you for sharing.
Can I say something?
Of course.
If you have protocols, for example, and you use them throughout, this is a way of documentation. So you could probably include these protocols, SOPs.
Yes. Like if anything, SOPs are an excellent way to help people understand the process more clearly than a lot of the other documentation available. And so I always encourage people to share SOPs if they can and if they have them, because it really provides the actual step-by-step process you took to do it. So perfect example of documentation there. Okay. So just for anyone who's familiar, SOP is known as a standard operating procedure. So it's how you would carry out a procedure from start to finish that's documented. So you would literally follow it to the letter to accomplish a specific task. Thanks for the nudge, Sarah. Okay, so I'm going to move on just because I want to make sure we have time to keep working through this. Any questions about storage and backup before we go forward? I feel like people got through that pretty quickly, so that's great. Should be a relatively straightforward way to approach this. So now we're going to move on to the difference between storage and preservation. And the focus here, again, is how are you going to make your data available for the long term? So two quick questions. Where will you deposit your data for long-term preservation? and access at the end of your project. So 5 years from now, how are you going to be able to access this data and be sure that it's going to be accessible? And then second is indicate how you're going to ensure your data is preservation ready. So this gets back to what we talked about last time with preservation formats in the slides. So changing any particular file formats that might be funky or that might be extracted from proprietary software that you're using, how are you going to make sure that that data is readable and understandable in a more friendly format? So that's the type of thing you want to document here. It's also highlighting anonymization and de-identification. So if you're working with patient data, obviously that data needs to be destroyed at a certain point. But if you de-identify it or anonymize it, meaning you remove all of the indicators that would allow you to identify a person, that would allow you to keep it for a longer period of time, because the data could not be traced back to an individual or a community, for example. So in this case, you want to provide a description of any data that you have. Consider, are there any issues with me sharing this or making it available long-term, and how do I do so? So just keep that in mind as you're working through this. And here's another example of what we've done. So in our case, we shared our data publicly on the Open Science Framework, which is an open platform that allows you to mint a digital object identifier. So it'll be around on the internet for the long term. And we saved all our data in CSV format, and all our documentation was saved in TXT format. So they can always be opened by any platform, anywhere, in perpetuity. So anything that we had that was an SOP or a protocol, we transferred it into a text document so it could always be opened. So these are things you can consider doing and an approach you can take to answer this question. So these are the two main questions we're going to ask. I'll touch base around 1:57, so 5 minutes for now, just to see where people are at. Again, I don't want to rush anybody, but take your time on the second question. Think about all your data, all your outputs. Well, are they easy to follow? Are they easy to read? Are they formatted in a way that could be corrupted later on? These are all things you want to consider when answering that second question. Detail about the question about, would you please detail more about inclusion and supporting documentation? What they want to see here is almost a reiteration of your documentation section. So the reason for that is they want to make sure the documentation is also preservation friendly. So what are you transforming and making preservation friendly? Because the data itself is one thing, that's great. But again, if none of the documentation is openable 3 years from now, that data is still rendered useless. So they just want to be able to see what are all the different documentation you're using, and are they in weird formats too? Like if you have scripts or README files that are in a strange format, how are you going to make sure that they're going to be changed as well? So it's just a way for you to be transparent about all of the research products and outputs that make your data understandable here. They're so much harder. So much harder because you can't tell if people are just staring over their laptops and working, or if they're finished and just waiting for you to start again. So I didn't see any hands, so we're going to move ahead. Okay. Now we get into one of the more complex areas of data management, and that's data sharing and reuse, because this is the indication where what the data management plan is asking you to do is, can you make your data and your documentation publicly available? Can you actually share it openly so that others can see it and use it and work with it as they please? And so we had a really great question in the REDCap survey form about the first question here. So what data will you be sharing, and in what form? Is it going to be raw, processed, or analyzed, or the final data? And so what the question was, what is the best data to share? Should you share raw data? Should you share analyzed data, and or the analyzed or the final data set? And really it depends, right? And so the raw data, if it's documented well, would allow someone else to take your data and pull from it and maybe ask their own research questions of it and be able to work with it in a way that's totally different from you, while still acknowledging that it's rooted in your work. The processed and the analyzed data shows how the data was transformed into its final product, which will show the analysis, which would allow you or someone else to look at how you analyze the data and potentially looking at your statistical approach and asking questions about that. The final product is the same, so they would be able to see the finished area of it. And so ultimately, as much as you can share is usually better because it's more transparent. If you remember last time, we talked about the concept of reproducibility. And so if you can, sharing the raw, processed, analyzed, and final data would allow someone to see your data in its original state and its full transformation into what you might publish in a paper, for example. And so ultimately, it depends on what you are eligible to do and what's possible. So for example, someone who works with personal health information wouldn't be able to share a raw data set because it would include all of the patient information. And unless they consented to doing so, that would be the only way you could share it. Whereas if you have an analyzed data set that's de-identified and shows the results of a particular method that you used, that's a different story. And so ultimately, it's up to you to figure out what you can share based on legal and ethical compliance, which is another part of this whole plan, versus the final product. So it's really a balance there for you to figure out how to do that. I see someone's unmuted. Is there a question there?
I have a certain concern about this, and together with the storage, which when you have really large raw data sets that you want to share them if they analyze them differently than you, but at the same time, it will be where, how, even, you know, if you have terabytes of data, what do you do?
Right. Yeah, so that's a great question. And it's, I think, a challenge a lot of researchers have because your data is sort of stuck in one place because it's the only place it can live. So maybe it's in data store or you've paid for Amazon cloud service to have it. And so what comes into play there, right, is what would it take for somebody to gain access to that data? So what you can do here instead is say the data cannot be publicly shared because the size is honestly too large for it to be sustainable. However, if someone wants to access this data, here's what they would have to do. Like, here's the financial investment they would have to take. Here's the software or platform they would have to use in order to get the data transferred over. So it becomes less about the actual public sharing of it and more the actual procedural process and logistics someone would have to go through to acquire that data in the first place.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
So, and that's where that's where this plan comes in. I will address another question here. So that's the first one. So what form are you sharing? Can you share it? Your answer to this question might be, I didn't get consent from the people I work with, and therefore I can't share it. And that's okay. The other thing is the end user license to include with your data. And we're going to talk about this in a second. But what you can do is if you share your data publicly, you can give it a license, which restricts how other people can use your data. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And the final one is what steps will be taken to help your community know that it exists. So this might be everything from I'm going to post on listservs in my community to make them aware that my data is existing, to I'm going to include a citation in my publication at the end to show that there's a data set available. I might include it in a data availability statement in a publication at the end of a paper so people know that it exists. This is really the chance for you to think about, how am I going to market that this data exists so other people will find it, use it, and gain access to it? So thinking about that, I wanted to just step aside here to talk a little bit about choosing a license. So adding a license to your data is really a way for you to retain copyright of your data while allowing others to take your data, distribute it, or make some reiterations of it. But it ensures that you get credit for your data. So there's a great link here that I'm hoping Sarah is going to share in the chat, and she's nodding, that allows you to look at the different kinds of licenses. So some licenses will say it can be shared and reused, but commercial entities can't reuse it. So I don't want commercial entities to take it and rebrand it and make money off my data. And that license prohibits them from doing so and holds them legally accountable to going against your license. And so that link, once it gets posted, you'll have a chance to look through it. But the license is just there to protect you and to allow you to dictate what you want others to do with your data if you share it publicly. So Sarah just shared the link there, so you can read through them and see what the different licenses look like. But the questions are, what are you sharing? Have you considered an end user license? And what steps will you take to make your community aware of what you're doing? So for this question, we'll take a little bit of time. The other thing we wanted to say is, if you are sharing, there are places where you can share already. So we talked a little bit about repositories last time. And what I encourage you to do during this time, and Sarah, if you wouldn't mind sharing these as well, take a look for the type of research that you do in the Federated Research Data Repository and see if there's other data like yours in there. Or go to Read Free Data and browse for your discipline to see what types of repositories exist. So that can be part of this exercise, is once those links come in, you can look through them as well. So take some time. This one, I'm going to give us a full 10 minutes for you to answer these questions and to play around with the repositories. Sarah just put the first one in, and then she'll put the directory in a second. But answer these questions. Take a look in the repositories, and then we'll touch base at 2:15. So it's 2:15. What I'd like to do is just check in again. I think I didn't see any hands, so I'm assuming people answered these questions okay. Was anyone able to find a repository of interest to them that was public around their research area? Or were they able to find a license that they felt like they would be willing to assign to their data based on the links that Sarah shared? So would anyone be willing to share in the chat or either out loud if you found a repository or if you chose a license that you'd like to share? Nobody. Okay. So commonly, when we think about data sharing more broadly, and I think what people and what the Tri-Agency is looking for are these open licenses like 4.0. So it's open, it's available, it can be reused, you get cited, and your work is as open as possible. But we realize that that's not always a level of comfort for everyone. And so the link that Sarah just shared is a way for you to answer a series of questions to see what type of license you might want to include based on your comfort level. And so it'll prompt you to say, do you want commercial reuse? Are you okay with people sharing it or completely changing your data overall? So I encourage you to take a look at that as well. And if you didn't have enough time, please take a look at some of those repositories because they can be great venues to make your data available if that's possible. Okay. So now we get to the
Can I ask
stage.
something before you move
Yes,
on?
please.
Can we get penalized if we use the most strict license, for example, criteria? If I'm applying to NSERC or so on.
Right. So sorry, I missed the first part of the question. Can
we be can it work against us if I use the very restricted license?
Good. Interesting question. Yes, it's I think my answer to that is I don't know because they haven't put out their criteria yet. So as far as I know, it's going to be a check mark from at least the policy level to say, do you have a plan? And if there's any particular outliers, they may follow up with questioning. And so if you have the most restrictive license and there's no reason for why you have that restrictive of a license, that might raise alarm for them, right? Because it's saying, well, this data isn't sensitive. And a lot of the things that we've been hearing from the Tri-Agency is you can't just keep it quiet because you want to save the data for later and you don't want other people to find your results. But as far as we know, you wouldn't be punished for doing so. That's your comfort level. It's your data. It's your intellectual property. And it's a license that you feel comfortable with. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm not necessarily sure why they would dock you marks on that, but it's just something to realize that they may come back and say why or ask for further details. So if you do choose a license that's a little bit more prohibitive, I would provide maybe a justification as to why you've chosen that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Can I make one more comment about licenses?
Of course.
I just wanted to highlight that applying a license to your data is different than enforcing the license. There's not really, you can choose a license and you can pick the most restrictive license, but if your data is in an open repository, the reality is that it's sort of more you're the researcher's aspirations for how you want this data to be used. So it's just important to know that it doesn't necessarily guarantee compliance, but you are doing all that you can and doing your due diligence to say this is the appropriate way to use this data. So it helps the user, but it's not always a guarantee.
Thank you. Good to know.
And,
Yeah.
and just to follow up on what Sarah mentioned is the difference there is by having your license there, if someone takes your data and does something that you don't want them to do with it, the license holds them accountable to that. So it's in an open repository. Sure, someone uses it some way that's against the license you've picked. If you were to ever challenge them, the license protects you to say, this is out of bounds based on what I indicated.
Yeah, I didn't mean to make it sound not useful. It's definitely still useful and a worthy thing to do.
Does USask actually have a very, like, do they prefer certain things? Because it's data that has been produced here.
It's not.
Is there a preferred license?
As far as I know, currently, no. So the research data management strategy is being produced as we speak, and there will be town halls, and it's going through processing. And so that is a question I think that should be raised, is there a preferred license for data depending on the restricted level and what's possible? So that's something that's actually very helpful for Sarah and I to take note of, to bring back to that group. So thank you for sharing that. Great questions, everybody. Okay. So now we were just talking about accountability exterior to your work. So other people who might use your data for something if you decide to share it publicly. But now we're getting to the idea more of internally. How are you holding people accountable for the data that you're creating? And so in this section, thinking about your role as a student, who is responsible for managing your project's data during and after the project? And what are the major data management tasks they're going to be responsible for? So this is why we had asked you to talk to your professor or your supervisor before coming, because these are the types of agreements that you're going to come to with them, right? So you're responsible maybe for your data throughout the project, but at the end of it, what happens? Where does that data go? Is it you who holds on to it? Does it get transferred over? These are the types of questions you're going to answer in this section. The other thing is, how is responsibilities for managing data management activities be handled if substantive changes happen in the personnel overseeing the project's data? So what we're looking for here is one of the biggest challenges in data management oftentimes is people coming in and out of a project team and leaving, and the data is a mess, doesn't make any sense. And so really what this is designed to do, because I know this was one of the questions in the survey that we sent out, is you want to have a continuity plan as well as an onboarding plan. So think about back to your documentation. All that information is going to help someone new who might pick up your project later on, continue on with it. And so this section, the second section, is that if there are big changes to personnel or to your project, you want to document what's going to happen and what information someone is going to be given in order to account for that change. So it's just a way for you to make sure that your legacy of your data and the work you did is going to be passed on to somebody else or to your supervisor. And then the last one, which I think is maybe going to be harder for some of the students here to answer, but it is a chance for faculty on the call to think about, what resources would you require to implement your plan? So is there funding that you need? Do you need a statistician or a data manager or someone or additional storage capacity in order to manage your data accordingly? This is where you would enter that in and estimate the cost of what that would be. So the first two are really about accountability and documenting who's responsible for what. And the last one is, what else do you need and how much is it going to cost? So these are the three components of this section. And this is how we answered this particular section for our data management plan. So we focused on who's responsible for managing the data, what the developer is responsible for, what the statistician was responsible for. All of this is laid out so we know exactly whoever's touching the data has a role, and the role is clearly described. So it's very clear to say, okay, if we didn't get the data back from the statistician, we know who to contact. Similarly, we thought we might have had additional collaborators in our project, and so we had an onboarding procedure that said anyone who comes onto the project needs to have this information before they start. They need to have an overview of the study. They need to know what the file structure is. They need to see the data collection plan, the storage plan, and the strategy that we have. So it's just a way for us to say, here's all the elements there. And then finally, what resources are required. And we've included the amount we paid for a developer and a statistician for our project. So take some time. Let's go until at least 2:30 to check. And then I'll check in then and see how we're doing. And then we'll reconvene. But I think we'll. So the final stage of the data management plan is around ethical and legal compliance. And so for the students on the call here, you may or may not be able to fill this out. And really, this is one where working with your supervisor is going to be key, because really they'll have a better understanding of where the project is going overall. But the first question, and this was one of the ones that was highlighted again in the survey, was what legal, ethical, or intellectual property issues are relevant to your data? And so what this means is that, are you working with participants potentially who didn't consent to having their data shared? This is where you would indicate that. Are you working with a particular firm that has patents on data that wouldn't allow you to share it? Any type of ethical concerns or intellectual property concerns here is where you would state what's available here. So you basically want to describe any reasons here that you need to be considerate of, respectful, or in regards to the data that you have. So oftentimes this section will align perfectly with your REB application or your research ethics application. And so what we're actually encouraging people to think about is reusing the same language that you might use in an ethics application to answer these questions as well. So really, it's a matter of, are you working with a community that owns the data that you aren't permitted to share? Are you working with data that is privatized or commercial that you're not legally allowed to make available to others? That's what you would include in this section. The next is how you're going to manage and store sensitive data and provide access to project members. So again, in your ethics application, it should indicate who is able to access this data and where. And so that's what they want to see in this section is, how are you going to manage it? How do people have access? And are they permitted to have access? And then finally, this gets to the idea that even though you can't share data, someone might still want to share it publicly. Someone still might want to go through the process of whether it's signing a contract or applying for their own ethics application to acquire the data. What would someone need to do to access data if it was sensitive or restricted in some way? So that third one is really about directions for someone else that they would need to follow, applications they would have to fill out, data use agreements that would allow them to gain access to your data. So as students here, this might be maybe too much detail for you, but we wanted to highlight them as important questions to work with, because it's likely that some of you might be working with data that has specific ethical or legal concerns. And it's just important for you to be aware of that. So just to keep that in mind, we won't take too much time on this one because our project didn't have sensitive data. That's what we wrote. And it wasn't applicable for us to take any strategies for sensitive data, so we put not applicable. And everything that we used was open and accessible online. So for us, we don't have necessarily a good example to show you of something more restricted, but if for those of you to take a few minutes to try to answer these questions, and if not, to talk to your supervisor before you finish the project. So I'll just give people a couple of minutes, and if you have questions about this, now is the time to ask them. We won't spend too much time on this one because I think doing it in class might be a bit of a challenge. Merle, do you have a question or a comment?
Not a question. I do have an example that I thought I'd add. I am a
Perfect.
historian and I work with data that's in archive. Well, I don't call it data, I'll call it sources that are in archives. And depending on the nature of the information that's held in the archives, sometimes I've had to do written agreements with the archive, particularly if something is of a restricted nature. There are sometimes documents within an archive that are restricted. And so you have to sign something very similar, a research agreement that says that you will not share any of the sensitive or restricted information that your publication or anything that you're going to do with that data will not compromise that. And so it is possible to have sort of research and ethical issues, sort of data within data and agreements within agreements. So I just wanted to make sure that that was shared.
And this is a very messy process for many people. If you look at a lot of the publications and you look at data access requirements, oftentimes it might say available upon reasonable request or available via application, but provide very little detail. And this is one way that the tri-agency is trying to make sure that people are more descriptive of what's possible. And Alana, I see your question here. So if we're working with a company or an individual who has signed an NDA, exactly, that would be included in this section. So this would say that certain data cannot be shared because NDAs were involved, and you would get as specific as you could be. Or if there's language in that NDA that you're supposed to use in other documents, that's what you would use here. So perfect example right there. So I'll just give everyone another minute or two to put some preliminary thoughts in here, or questions that you want to bring up with your supervisor if you have them. And then, so you've gotten to the end of your data management plan. Good for you. That's great. It's a great start. So, but now what? Now what do you do with it? So the first step, again, if you're applying for funding, is it would go into your funding application and you'd submit it. And so again, you can do that on the particular page by downloading here. And again, you can download it as a PDF form or a text file. Again, if we're thinking about preservation, PDF or text are those friendly formats, and that can get uploaded into your application. That's also what we're hoping that you will share with us once you've completed your plan. So all you need to do is download it into one of these formats. Whatever you prefer is fine with us, and then we can access it, no problem. But what we also want you to think about is that really a data management plan should be a living document. So ultimately, again, the whole point of this is we all know research is fluid, it changes, protocols change, the way we approach something changes. And so ultimately, it can serve as your guide for keeping your research organized, managing people on your team. So for example, if you onboard a new student or you start working with someone else on your data who comes in over the summer, you would change their name in the plan to reflect that responsibility. So don't think of this as like a frozen document that's etched into stone that you leave in the middle of a lab. It's something that you always want to return to and make sure it's holding you accountable for the work that you do. So if your project changes, your DMP should change as well to make sure that that organization carries throughout. So in terms of some resources to guide you, again, we shared this last time, but we felt like it was important to reiterate this again. As you're finishing off your plan for submission, there are a number of different templates you can use, as well as examples and the guide that we have in a previous SURE presentation as well. So please use these as you work through them to get a sense. We showed you one example today, but there are so many others beyond this. And in terms of the next steps, there's really only two things that are left over the course of the RDM plan. So the first is the data management plan assignment. So what we'd like you to do is by June 17th, submit your final data management plan as you created today to myself, to Sarah, and your supervisor in an email. And what we're going to do is Sarah and I will look through these data management plans and provide you feedback in July. If you're done your project already or your plan today, or you're finished early, you're welcome to send it in earlier. That's fine. We're keeping track of all of this. And then the second thing is we want you to think about how data management has potentially changed or not changed your work as you work through the summer project. And so when you finish in August, you're going to receive an email from us with formal instructions on what to do. And really what we want you to do is to reflect on your experience learning about and practicing research data management. And so the questions for that really are going to be around, do you see any benefits to building a data management plan? What were some of the challenges or drawbacks that you had in doing one? Did it actually help you with your work or not? And what impact do you think data management can have on your own research, on the future of research? And we hope that for students who fill this out, that you're candid with us. If you think that data management was the worst and you felt terrible doing it, let us know. And if you think it really helped and changed the way you did your work, let us know that as well. We want you to be open with that. And it's about 500 words in order to do so. And completing those two things will get you the co-curricular credit to make sure that you have achieved and completed the overall project as a whole. So just some things to keep in mind. Something else I will mention is that we are hoping to share some of our results to actually look at the reflection assignments and potentially share them. So there will be a consent form disseminated asking if we could use your anonymized reflection assignments to share what we learned from this project with the larger library community. This is totally optional and you don't have to, but please note that you will receive an email asking whether or not you'd like to participate. So you're welcome to, but if you're not comfortable doing so, that's also fine too. So more details about that will follow up after this presentation. So we'll stop it there. We finished about 20 minutes early, which is great. We're happy to answer any questions you have about the last two components of the program, anything you heard about today, anything you'd like to share. And we'd like to thank you again for coming today and participating in potentially a not very workshop-y format, but at the same time, I hope that you got a chance to work on this and think about data management a little bit more broadly. So thanks for your time today, and you're welcome to leave or stay around for questions. We'll stick around for a bit until everyone's gone. So thanks so much. Emerald, do you have any plugs for sure going forward?
I always have plugs for sure. So just a reminder to everyone who's here is that you may have been signed up for the research data management sessions and to do a research data management plan, but it's possible that you were not also signed up for the larger SURE program. And so I'm going to put a link to the larger SURE program. The deadline to register for that program was actually this past Friday. So I've closed the link, but all you need to do is just send me an email and take a look at the larger SURE program, and we have a whole lot of great programming coming up this summer, and you are welcome to drop in and join us for any and all of that.
Thank you, Merle, and thank you all for your participation. It's been really wonderful hearing your questions. This is a challenging topic, and it's something that until you start working on it, more and more questions will come up, and you may be working over the summer and say, ooh, this is something I didn't consider that I should put in my plan. So thanks again. We're happy to answer questions, but if not, you're free for the afternoon. Go enjoy the sun. Actually, it looks kind of cloudy now, but either way, enjoy your afternoon, and thanks so much.